I asked Brother Brady to read this passage this morning from 1 Corinthians 14 because it fits into two different series that I have been preaching over the last several months and longer. I've actually been preaching a series through the book of 1 Corinthians. And after this lesson today, we'll only have 2 chapters to go to complete having preached all the way through the book of 1 Corinthians. But this year, 2011, at least once a month, we have been doing a series, The Truth About Controversies. And there is a significant controversy among churches, and especially probably among churches of Christ, about the role of women in the public worship. And so this passage from 1 Corinthians 14 is the next passage that we were ready for in our lessons through 1 Corinthians. And it's also one of the 2 most applicable passages in studying the role of women in public worship. As we have done in all of the lessons so far, the truth about the truth about baptism, the truth about instrumental music, the truth about the fall of man, we have looked at what people say with whom we have not traditionally agreed to make sure we understand what the disagreement is and where the disagreement is. Up until this month, every one of those quotations that I have brought you from people who at least disagree with what I believe have been from people outside our fellowship. But several years ago, right after Lauren was born, our oldest, not right after she was born, but she was maybe a year or 2 old, Michelle and I took a weekend trip to New York City. And we went to church up there, went to worship with the Manhattan Church of Christ. And I had been there when I was younger and had worshiped there, remembered it fondly. And so we went back to that same place, and it's right off of Madison Avenue, which is the big advertising capital of New York City. And it's just on a little cross street, less than a block from Madison Avenue in Manhattan, where all the huge buildings are. We go in there, we get there in time for worship, we sit down, and things are a little bit different there than they are here, but it's New York, you expect that. But then it came time for the Lord's Supper, and they were singing a song to get ready for the Lord's Supper, and it's obvious what the song is to prepare us for. And as they do that, I notice a lady gets up and walks down the far side aisle and sits or stops right at the front of the auditorium. And then after the song stops, sure enough, she walks up to the microphone and starts to speak. And to be fair, they had put in their bulletin, which they had in the pews, the backs of the pews, the order of worship that day. And we saw a name there, and it looked like a woman's name. So I was watching for her when she stood up to go. I don't know what she said because, quite frankly, we left. I couldn't stay there because I hold my beliefs very strongly, and I want you to know that. But when we got back home, I sent an email to the congregation. I sent an email to the congregation there at the Manhattan Church of Christ to tell them how disappointed I was in what they were doing, and pointed out a scripture or 2 like 1 Corinthians 14 to them. And the secretary responded to my email, and she attached a book to her email. And she said, well, I know that's what, churches of Christ have traditionally believed, but here's why we don't believe it. Our preacher has written this book, and this will explain why we do what we do. And so I've got that book. I've still got it in my house. I printed it out on my computer. It's quite long, for a book that you can email. But you can also find it for free on the internet. It's written by a man named Thomas Robinson, who is the minister, the preacher there at the Manhattan Church of Christ. It was written in 2002. The book is called A Community Without Barriers, Women in the New Testament and the Church Today. So my point is, when we we talk about the controversy today, it's not coming from somebody outside Churches of Christ. It's coming from a Church of Christ preacher. And basically what he says about this passage that Brady read from 1 Corinthians 14, especially verses 34 and 35, if you look at it again, verse 34 says, the women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are also to subject themselves, just as the law also says. He says that does not apply to us today. His book is very well written. I learned some very interesting things about the culture of Corinth from his book, and it's easy to read and easy to understand. But his conclusion is that this passage here, 1 Corinthians 14, does not apply to us today. And he's got several arguments, several reasons that he presents, but I want to share two of them with you because I think they are his two biggest primary arguments. And they really are very closely connected. His arguments are that if we interpret this passage to mean that women for all time and all places cannot speak in the worship assembly of the church, then that necessarily contradicts other things that Paul taught in this very book. I'll give you an example. He says on page 71 of his book, talking about 1 Corinthians 14, he says, we must also hold that when Paul says, I want all of you to prophesy, he actually intends to exclude half of the congregation without saying so. Similarly, when he speaks of the whole church, or when he says, you can all prophesy one by one, he does not include the women in the whole church or in you all. Such a procedure of interpretation imputes self-contradiction or dishonesty to Paul. So what he's saying is, if you interpret 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35 to mean that women cannot speak in churches, then you're saying Paul is contradicting himself. And I'll show you what he's talking about. If you back up earlier in the chapter of 1 Corinthians 14, in verse 5, he says, now I wish that you all spoke in tongues. That's one of the places where he uses the word you all. In verse 23, he says, therefore, if the whole church assembles together and all speak in tongues, that's another place where he says all. Verse 24, but if all prophesy and an unbeliever or an ungifted man enters. Verse 26, what is the outcome then, brethren? When you assemble, each one has a psalm, has a teaching, has a revelation, has a tongue, has an interpretation. Also verse 31, for you can all prophesy one by one, so that all may learn and all may be exhorted. He says if we read this to exclude women, what Paul teaches here earlier in chapter 14, then Paul's contradicting himself. That's his first argument. That's the quote that I read from him first. The second part of his argument goes back to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And I'll show you that passage before I read you his quote. Look back with me at 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he's talking about women wearing head coverings. And when we covered this passage, which was quite some time ago, I said, now we're going to come back and talk about this again. I'm sure you all remember me saying that. But I'm keeping my promise. We're going to come back and talk about this again today, the Lord willing. But in verse 5, he says, verse 5. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. For she is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. Verse 6. Down to verse 13. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head covered? Now, to me, this is a better argument than the argument that he makes from 1 Corinthians 14. Because 1 Corinthians 14 is followed right there by verses 34, 35 and following in the exact same chapter, just right behind it. And so you can't say something, give a caveat, and then somebody come back along and say the caveat contradicts what you said. That's what the caveat's for. But in 1 Corinthians 11, he clearly says women prophesy. He clearly says women pray. Now that raises an issue. But here's what Mr. Robinson says about that, page 75 of his book. He says, the basic problem in understanding what this passage meant to Paul and the Corinthians arises from the fact that at first reading this passage seems to stand in contradiction to what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 5. Paul's instructions requiring women to wear head coverings when they pray and prophesy becomes nonsensical if Paul was about to impose an absolute prohibition against women speaking at all. So, that's the argument that's presented. 1 Corinthians 11, 34 and 35 cannot mean women can't speak in church, because earlier in chapter 14, everybody can speak, and back in chapter 11, women specifically are pictured as speaking. So we need to we've understood it wrong. That's what he says. I want to address these arguments, and I want to point out a couple of things. Let's start in 1 Corinthians 14, which I sort of got ahead of myself a little bit in telling you what my response is. But in 1 Corinthians 14, look at the plain language of verse 34. Plain language says, the women are to keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but are to subject themselves, just as the law also says. Let me ask you a question. How much plainer can God make this language? Is there a way to reword this language to make it clearer? The women are to keep silent in the churches. Now, if I say to my children, I want y'all to get all your toys out of the yard. I want you to bring in your bicycles. I want you to bring in your scooters. I want you to bring in your dolls. I want you to bring in your balls. Everything out of the yard and put it in its place. But I want my youngest son, Mark, to stay inside because I want to keep him out of the grass where he starts sneezing and gets sick. Have I contradicted myself by telling my children to clean up the yard while telling one of my children to stay inside? No, I haven't. Because what I said at the end modifies what I said earlier. I just don't think there's an intellectually honest argument where you can say verses 34 and 35 contradict the earlier part of 1 Corinthians 14. So let's talk about chapter 11.